Okay, so I'm here for Sean today. I'll get to who I am in a moment because Sean has a slide built in for that. The first announcement I have to make is that there was a winter social that was supposed to be this Friday, and he promoted it in a few classes ago. That's been canceled, unfortunately. They felt it was safe for now, or not safe right now, to have an event like that. So that'll be postponed for now. So if you're going to the winter social, the Classics Winter Social, I think it was called, that's been canceled for now. Okay, today's lecture, I will introduce who I am. We'll talk about women in ancient Greece, and we'll give two case studies. I understand, well, we'll get to that in a second. Two quick case studies, Athens and Sparta. Then we'll talk about a poet named Semonides, and then we'll talk a bit more about Pandora before wrapping up. This is me. I am Tristan Ellenberger. I'm a PhD student. Hopefully, I'll have a PhD in a few weeks. And this is me, Akalithea. I'm an archaeologist, just like Sean. And this is a dig that we have in Greece. I don't think it's going right now because of the pandemic. But when we did, I worked on it. So that's what I do. I study identity in how it's manifested through the burials of Roman burials in a place called Pannonia. That's what I do. So I understand last class, there was a lot of discussion about the way women are depicted in Hesiod. And I guess how much that reflects what was going on in 8th, 7th century Greece. And so this lecture was built, I think, largely in response to that. Not being there, I don't completely know, but I think Sean was quite impressed with the discussion that came out of it and wanted to elaborate more on it and give more context. Before we begin talking about the context, and I'm sure Sean already said that because it's one of the themes of the courses, we have to be aware that women weren't treated the same in all locations, in all times, and all situations as well. The misogyny was situational. This is a patriarchal society, so women had their place, but we will talk about other examples where we know that women had a bit more freedom. On Hesiod's side, from what you can see from this passage, I think, have you guys already went over this passage, or? You guys have already went over this passage. Clearly, Hesiod has a big problem with women and is a misogynist. How widespread was this view in antiquity? And clearly, he puts this all, or much of it, on Pandora. And through Pandora, he talks about, presumably, his own wife and other women as well. That all they do is stay at home, like drones, and they eat food that the worker bees bring in, himself, and do nothing. Are there any questions or anything you want to add to that before we go on? Apparently, women were created as a punishment. We'll talk more about this in a bit. Hesiod has his view, and we certainly don't agree with it today. What he did back then, probably perfectly acceptable in most situations. Okay. Again, this isn't unique towards Hesiod, but we'll explore a little more about how they treated women through case studies. We're going to talk first about Athens. Now, you've probably seen this map of Greece before. We're going to talk about this area right here, Athens. I think he goes into, yep. And then more specifically, Athens right here. The reason why anybody know why we're talking about Athens? Why everything seems to be focused on Athens? A lot of our poets, playwrights, philosophers all come from Athens or who studied in Athens. Yeah, up there.
Classics used to be concerned about Athens.
Pardon?
The study of classics in ages and ages ago used to just be concerned about, I think, 5th to 8th century Athens.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you very well.
Classics used to be just concerned with 5th and 8th century Athens.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, a lot of people were concerned with Athens. Athens was a big deal. A lot of authors come from Athens, it was a cultural capital. And that's why we're so Athenocentric, why a lot of this stuff comes down to what the Athenians did. What the Athenians did, though, as we talk about with Sparta as a counterpoint, and that is if we have our own problems with Sparta, cannot be taken for the rest of Greece. Okay, so in Athens, now again, women were never full citizens in Athens. That's fine. Well, not fine. But that we can say for sure. But women, the presentation of women that I'm going to be given of Athens come from a very specific time. In 5th century Athens, the Athenians have a powerful empire. They're very rich. There are many people who want to be Athenians. And they decide to lock down on their citizenship. By the mid-5th century, only those people with an Athenian father and an Athenian mother, so citizens, are considered full citizenship. Are considered full citizens. Anybody else at that time, when that law was made, who had a father who was an Athenian or a mother who was an Athenian, was not considered an Athenian anymore. So automatically, if they continued to pretend they were Athenians, they were exiled or put into slavery. So automatically, they cut down on their citizenship. So citizenship was being guarded. And when you guard citizenship, you also guard women. So a lot of these rules came about at this time that we're talking about. But we're going to be talking about women in Athens asynchronically. But a lot of what we know from Athens comes from after this time. So, and I will try to specify what I'm talking about and make clear what time period I am discussing. So they're not full citizens. So what is a citizen? What is a citizen? Do you guys know? Any idea what a citizen is? Yeah.
A man?
A man. And okay, so in this case, it's a man. Yeah. So we have in Greece, in all places that I know, well, not all places, but in Athens, a citizen was a man, or at least a full citizen. What makes an adult citizen above the age of 20? And then as you get older, you become more and more enfranchised. Okay, so what else? What is a citizen? Yeah.
Belonging to a certain place.
Belonging to a certain place. So in this case, a state, the state of Athens. Now, Athenians are interesting. They claim descent from the earth. They're chthonic. Let's see if I can remember to spell that. Or chthonous. You spell it I-C or O-U-S. Their early kings, their early figures, all come from the earth. That's how they can afford to define their citizenship, I guess, because they guard that citizenship, and they privilege that citizenship because they come from the earth. So they're bounded. Now, that being said, in many points of Athenian history, foreigners were made citizens. That happened. But in the 5th century, when Athens was becoming rich, many people wanted to move to Athens, wanted to be a citizen, acted like citizens without actually having citizenship. They locked down on that quick. And then they claimed this privilege that they were always in Athens. And that myth already existed, but now became reified and more prominent. So, we have a bounded community that belongs, and they also have a common origin, even if some people's ancestors came from away. And we certainly know that was the case. Okay, what else is a citizen? Yeah.
Somebody who actively contributes to the society?
Yeah, and how would you contribute to Athenian society via that? You or somebody else? Yeah.
Well, other men would go to war or participate in like the democracy.
Yes, exactly. Go to war and participate in government. Yeah, and do you have anything else?
Having rights to vote and property.
Own property and vote. That's right. Foreigners at this time, and this point in Athens, could not own property. They could run businesses. They could be very influential, but they couldn't take part in government. And they couldn't serve on the law courts. And they actually did fight in the army sometimes. But actually, they did fight in the army. They could fight in the army, but they weren't fully enfranchised. So yeah, you have certain obligations to the state. And those were some of the obligations back in Athens, and we'd go on and on and on about that. But the state also had obligations to its citizens. Now in Athens, there was like a grain dole sometimes. They would hand out grain, like handouts. You would be expected to conform to Athenian law. You would have rights as an Athenian in Athens, and maybe with certain allies that had treaties with you. So there were certain obligations and protections that came across with being a citizen. Now, women were not full citizens. They were not fully citizens, even though you need an Athenian woman to have an Athenian citizen. They did not participate politically. They were the property of their father until marriage, and then they became property of their husband. And if there was no husband or no father, then it was an in-law or a brother or something. There was always a male guardian. They had no property rights. Any property passed through sons, and if a woman did have property, sometimes it did have it, it would pass through to another male relative. So this is a very constricted society. It's a very constricted society. Women don't have a lot of participation, and these laws get stronger as they went. Yeah?
What do you mean by necessary for male citizenship? Does a male need a woman to be a citizen?
Oh yeah, you need an Athenian mother, right? Yeah, sorry, I should have been more specific, but you need an Athenian mother to have an Athenian. And they could go to Athenian law courts, but they needed a guardian or needed someone to represent them and such. But they did not have the same rights as a male citizen. They weren't full citizens. They were not enfranchised, and they solely relied on men at this time. Now, if we go much earlier, Sean put in this quote: Solon provided that there must be sexual intercourse between a couple 3 times a month. That seems really strange. Like legislation like that these days would never ever fly. That wouldn't even make it onto the floor. But Solon is writing, so I'm talking about the mid-5th century, or later, like 450 to the end of the 5th century. Solon is much earlier. He's at the very beginning of the 6th century, so about 595 or so, 596. And he was a legislature brought in to deal with all sorts of crises that were going on in Athens. And he legislated this. And he's in a patriarchal society. He's a man who comes up with solutions to marriages that, from his point of view, I'm sure he thinks he's doing fine for women, but it's from a male point of view, so that's, as we know, that's problematic. But the reason why he had people do this, or legislated it, and it's really weird, but again, in the early 6th century, we're at the infancy of citizenship, of the state, and of state laws. The first law code in Athens had only been brought forward about 35 years earlier. So law is in its infancy, and state control and what the state can dictate is also in its infancy. So Solon was trying to solve society's ills, and one of the problems is, among aristocratic couples, they were getting married for the wrong reasons. They were getting married for money and power. Marriages were alliances. Women brought dowries to their marriage, which was a form of wealth, which cemented the alliance, made the husband richer, and so people were married for the wrong reasons. And so he wanted to solve this, and one way he thought he could solve this was by having men and women, a husband and wife, have to go together in the bridal chamber and make love 3 times a month. Again, that kind of legislation, we would say you can't interfere with that. That's our own private lives. But law is in its infancy, and he was trying to solve some societal ills. Here, divorce is always, get to your, just one second. Divorce is usually bad in our society. It can get very messy. But in ancient Athenian society, where the state was not strong, if there was a messy divorce, you have 2 factions go at each other, possibly go at each other, and there would be violence. So it was a little, the urgency was there a bit more. Sorry, you have a question?
Yeah.
Or a point?
Do you think that he meant at least 3 times, or exactly 3 times?
At least 3 times. What happens is he legislates. I don't know how you would follow through with this. There's no way to enforce it. But it was probably as much of a suggestion as anything. If you went to the law courts, they might say, well, did you do this? Did you do that to save your marriage? Or what's that?
They would probably just listen to the man anyways. They wouldn't take the woman's word.
No, they wouldn't. Probably not, no. I mean, but it would be not just, it wouldn't just be a man, it would be men. Because you would have every man. So they had prominent families, they had phratries, which were these brotherhoods. These were organizations that were in the state, but existed outside of the state, were not in state control. And they handled a lot of this. So you would have men talking about this sort of thing outside of the courts or inside the courts, arguing what happened. And these divorces did lead, and the issues in the marriages did lead to serious problems. So that's where Solon is coming from on this one. Now, I have another quote. I should have put it up here, but we have a famous orator named, sorry, not orator, just an orator, but he's a politician. His name is Pericles. And he was another Athenian reformer or Athenian leader when Athens was a democracy in the mid-5th century. He died in about 430. But he gave this famous funeral oration, and mentioned women a lot in this funeral oration. But at this time, this just illustrates the place of women in Athenian society at the time. He said, the greatest glory for a woman is not to be talked about. That would not, if you say that, you're getting canceled these days. I mean, that is not, we don't consider that appropriate, but women were supposed to, and this is mostly deals with upper class women, not lower class women. It's upper class women. You have a certain decorum, a certain way of conducting yourself, and upper class men are supposed to conduct themselves in a certain way in the society, and that's a reinforcement of it. And this line comes up a number of times in other places as well, that women are not to be talked about. Because if you talk about a woman, chances are it's not good, they're not to be talked about. And this was very problematic. There are some people who didn't even meet their husband. You know, if you were a friend of a guy, you might never meet the wife. The wife is in the house. This did happen sometimes. Now, that being said, women could partake in festivals. There were festivals just for women, and they sometimes could be part of life. So you have this ideal, but it's not necessarily matched by reality, because especially the lower classes, the practicality is women had to work. Women did take more of an active role, visible role in society. Were they looked down by the upper classes? Probably. So we have a mix. It all depends. And a lot of what we're talking about, the norms, are ideals of the upper class. Maybe even middle class or so. Okay. So these are, I put these up. These are chorae. These are statues from the late 6th century. These are young women. These are found as grave monuments or as dedications to gods. This gives you an idea of what young women, probably about your age, well, no, younger than you, would have looked like. And we have to remember, when we're talking about Hesiod, going back to Hesiod again, and he says that women were a drain on a household, this is a bit false. Or no, when I say a bit false, I mean totally false. Women contributed to the economy of the household. Chances are these girls being pictured here, now they would be upper class girls, they either would have probably have made their own clothes, wove and sewed, and I think Sean has brought this up before. It was a skill you were supposed to learn when you were younger. It's what you contribute to the household. And if you were a rich upper class person, you had to manage the enslaved people or servants of your household. So you were an intimate part of the household. Now clearly, you see it as a different view, but the practicality is, from other sources that we know, women were essential. Now, men still made sure they knew their place. That doesn't apply today. But we don't have the blatant, aggressive negativity. We just have hegemonic patriarchy. So that's not good either. But these are what young women would look like. And these are young women that would actually partake in religious festivals. As basket bearers, they were expected in festivals. Okay. And this is also, these are young girls. This is what they would bring, the finery that they have on. This is what they would bring to a marriage. Okay, I think that's all I have to say about Athens. Are there any questions about Athens before we move on to Sparta? Yeah.
Why did they treat their women so restricted when they have so many gods that they place that are women that they see as powerful?
Oh, that's a good question. That's I don't know. And I don't think they do know. I mean, okay. The gods that the Greeks had took form over a number of centuries. Many of the Greek gods like Athena, some gods like Hera, Artemis, all were influenced from different parts of the world. Hera might have been at one time the patron protective goddess of Argos, a city in the Peloponnese. Athena is a warrior goddess, but also a protector of cities, as Athena Polias. Athena Polis. Polis is a word for city-state or citizen-state or state in Greece. And Polias, she is the protector of citizen-state. Now, what's the point of all this? These are all, these are powerful goddesses. And these come from, these goddesses would have this function, or goddesses like them would have this function in the Mycenaean age. And these goddesses were influenced by other gods and goddesses in the Near East, where they also had these types of gods. And so, what I'm trying to say is these gods developed, they became kind of reified. You can't change them. They always were there. They're traditional. You can change to a certain point. You can adapt them to society. That did happen. And next class we can talk about that a little more. It's a loaded subject. But they didn't necessarily mirror what was going on in Greek society in the 5th century. But Athena's been around. Athena is the patron goddess. And they do deal with that. I can talk a little bit more about that. But that's a very good question. And one that I can't really answer. You have gods, myths are retold, as you know, in certain contexts or worshipped in certain contexts. But just like today with a lot of stories, movies, that we have a hard problem with today because they don't reflect the norms or our ideals that we want to project today, they still exist. And sometimes you deal with them in different ways. But they're kind of fossils of an earlier time, or adapted to make palatable in that time, but still carry a lot of the connotations that they had before. Does that make sense? I'm kind of babbling. That was a really good question, but one that I can't really answer and they can't really answer. They did deal with this kind of stuff, though, with Athena. But we can talk about that next class. Any other questions or comments? All right. Sparta. Okay, so Sparta is located right here in the southern Peloponnese. I don't know how much Sean has talked about Sparta. Sparta's right here. Sparta's a very different society from Athens. Very different. In fact, it's the polar opposite. And before I continue about talking about Sparta, there's some things that you need to know. Athens, we have a lot of sources about Athens, because Athens was a very big, rich, powerful city. A lot of Athenians wrote in it. It attracted artists, poets, philosophers from all over the Greek world at different times to come study it. And so we know a lot about, we don't know a lot about Athens. We'd love to know more. We know about the aristocrat or the upper classes. We know a lot about certain things for the ancient world. Now, the problem with Sparta is there's not actually a lot of Spartans that wrote stuff down, at least that survives. So we don't necessarily have a voice from their culture about their own society. It's the Athenians who wrote about the Spartans. That's problematic because the Athenians take the Spartans in many ways as the opposites of themselves. So anything that the Athenians did, chances are the Spartans would do the opposite. And we don't know how much of this is true and how much of it is an othering or the Athenians or other writers from other parts of Greece defining the Spartans against themselves. The Spartans were an exotic culture. Even many Greeks thought that as well. So we have to take everything that we talk about with a little grain of salt, although there are some things that are absolutely true. So in Sparta, women, just like in Athens actually, were considered essential to the running of the state. They were considered full citizens. They learned how to sew, they learned how to weave when they were younger, just like the Athenians. Now, Sparta also had a very large enslaved population. So when women became wives, they didn't actually have to weave and sew to maintain the economy. They didn't have to do that. They had more leisure. They also had other populations that weren't full Spartan citizens that did a lot of the other work. That's so they can concentrate on raising good, well, women didn't raise Spartan kids necessarily, but concentrate on other things, running the household, for example. But they were considered essential. They did have limited political participation. Now, from anecdotes, we know that there were many Spartan women who you couldn't vote, you couldn't sit on any council or anything, but they did have a lot of influence. But they probably didn't Athens too. But we know more about some of the Spartan women that had a lot of influence. They were given much more of an open role in society. They were the property of their father, then the property of their husbands, same in Athens to an extent. But women could inherit property, and they did. By the end of the 4th century, towards the end of the 4th century, we are told that Spartan women owned 2/5 of all the land in Sparta, which is probably more land proportion than women would own, say, in Canada, although I don't know the stats on that, because women had more of a role. Or full Spartan citizens had more of a role. Now, their upbringing was very different. I told you that they know how to weave and they knew how to sew. They learned those things, same as Athenian women. They knew how to manage a household, they had to. But they also exercised. And just like men, and we think it's weird, they exercised in the nude. At least that's what the Athenians want to tell us. They were also forbidden, Sean puts on here, they were forbidden to marry before they were teens. So were boys, too. Unlike Athens, if you were a man, you'd be in your 30s, late 20s, 30s, and you could be married to a girl very young, like 14. But in Sparta, they believed that the man and the woman should be closer in age, so it would be in your late teens, early 20s that you would get married. Okay, any more questions before I go on and show? I think I have a few pictures and a few anecdotes about Spartan women. Spartan men went to different classes, and were basically separated. Actually, the whole video on this, I forgot about that. So I'll show you that in a second. Any questions about Sparta before I go on? Oh, sorry, yeah.
So are women full citizens in Sparta, or no?
As much as you can be when you're not enfranchised, right? So from our point of view, from what we talked about, what a citizen was and the obligations to the state, I guess they were full citizens, but they had totally different responsibilities. Yeah. Yeah.
So, sorry, you said Sparta didn't have any authors, so if you didn't write about them, very little.
We know very little about what they thought of themselves. We do have some poets, some early poets. The closest we have to someone who was very knowledgeable about Spartans' right is a guy named Xenophon, and he actually lived. His sons took part in the Spartan education system, and he was the Athenian ambassador to Sparta, and because of that, he lived in Sparta and spent exile. He was exiled to Sparta as well, and he wrote an account of the Spartans. So that's probably the best account that we have, and the closest we get. But we do have very early Spartan poets who talk about war and stuff like that, war and
Most of the
stuff.
facts we know are based off of Athenians' point of view.
Yeah. Not just, I emphasize the Athenians. It just so happens that a lot of what the Spartans do are the exact opposite of the Athenians. But there's other writers as well that are right outside. But a lot of them are Athenian or come from an Athenian point of view. Okay, this is a figure. Women partook in athletics. We're told they partook in athletics in the nude, just like the boys did, or the men and the boys did. But here we have what's presumed to be a Laconian woman, though it could be a woman just taking place. There were games like the Olympics at Olympia that took place for women. It could just be a girl partaking in the Horion, I think it was called, games dedicated to Hera that women could take part in, or girls could take part in, and it could be just that. But they think it's a Spartan girl or a Laconian girl, the area around Sparta. Actually, what's interesting, we just had the Olympics, so I thought I'd put this up. The first Olympic victor or the first female Olympic victor in history was a woman, Caidiska. Caidiska means puppy. Not exactly the name you would call a Spartan girl, but her grandfather, who she was dear to, was named also Puppy. Not a good Spartan name. I don't think he was ever king. But she was a Spartan princess. Spartans had 2 kings, and she was a princess, and she was actually the first female Olympic victor. Women could not attend the Olympics at the time that we're talking about. You could be put to death if you were a woman who attended the Olympics. But what you could do is, if you're a woman, you could put together a chariot team, and you could have it race. Find a driver, rear the horse, find the horses, the chariot team, get everything going, just like I guess in the NASCAR or Formula One race today, and they could race. And she was the first, even though she never saw her horses win, she was the first person ever to win at the Olympics because it was the owner of the chariot team, or the chariots and the horses, that got the credit for the victory. And so she won a few times. This is historically tested. And we even have one of the bases that survive of one of the statues of her victory. It says, "Kings of Sparta are my father and brothers. Caidiska, victorious with a chariot of swift-footed horses, have erected this statue. I declare myself the only woman in all of Hellas," that's what the Greeks called their country, Greece, "to have won this crown." And then it says who made the base. So, maybe interesting fact, I don't know. She was the first one to win, but it does go to show that women did have a lot of power, a lot more free reign in their power, that she was an upper class woman, of course, but she could field a chariot team and have it win, shows that, she had quite a bit of power. Yeah.
Could you comment on the 2 kings?
Oh, the 2 kings? Yeah, the Spartans had an odd constitution. They had 2 kings. They were one of the only places in Greece to have 2 kings. It was an old kind of tradition. They kept it. The kings didn't necessarily have a lot of political power, and they weren't kings as we would think with all this finery and stuff, but they did have a role in society. They were supposed to take part in religious roles, had certain bodies, or lead them. They were leaders in war. They were the ones who, for the most part, when possible, led the army. One would stay home, one would lead the army. And they came from 2 different families that were descended. They claimed descendants from Hercules. And so it was tradition, and this institution stayed. Once their constitution became reified, it didn't change a whole lot. So they didn't have absolute power like we would think a king would, and they ruled within a constitution. There were other bodies that governed and also had a lot of power. Yeah.
So the kings, they basically talk about our queen does. She doesn't do all the stuff, but there's certain things she does do for our country.
Yeah, exactly. I would say, and that's a good point. I would say somewhere in between our constitutional monarch, that's kind of the figurehead, gives advice, and an absolute monarch kind of. They ruled with it, or they were the kings of Sparta, they were the figureheads, they would be delegates. They didn't have absolute power. There were checks and balances against them, and they didn't have all the finery. They're Spartans, so I mean, they didn't live in palaces or anything like that, or have gold or anything like that, right? Yeah.
Was there other leaders that had, what leaders would have more power than the kings?
There were 5 efforts that were elected every year. They didn't have more power than the kings, but they acted as a check. They also had quite a bit of power. The Jedrusia, which the kings were part, elder statesmen, there were 30 of them. The kings were always 2 of them. I think you had to be above the age of 60, 65. That was also a powerful body. And those were the main ones that acted as kind of checks or helped complement the power of the kings. Spartan society is fascinating. So is myth. They all intertwine. But we're talking about the role of women. Oh yeah, and here's the last thing that this is Sean put up this video. It's pretty funny, and hopefully it fills in some of the gaps that I might have left out about Athenian.
Horrible history.
Well, it's posted anyway. I have no idea how that happened. I think because I went to the whole site, but it worked last night. It was a fun video on Spartan and Athenian men and women and their contrast. But yeah, that's the wrong video. Yeah, no, it's supposed to be pegged to the. Now you guys probably know more about technology than I do. This video was pegged to the PDF, and it was supposed to show, but it did not. Well, okay, so we'll skip the video. We can always show it next class. Okay, so that was supposed to be any questions about the video, but do you have any questions before we go on? That's a bit about Spartan women, a bit about, so you can't take what we talk about in Athens or Hesiod to be the norm. There's no doubt about it, this was a patriarchal society. Men ruled, we have mostly men's voices, but we can talk more a bit about that in a moment. Not the only voices, in different places, different situations, at different times. There were varying degrees of power, but we're still firmly entrenched in a patriarchal society where men had most of the governing rule. Did Hesiod's view permeate all of society? Certainly not. I don't think so. Yeah.
So Hesiod, I believe, like Sean mentioned it before, Zeus was Hesiod's hero, or it was somewhere in the notes. But if Zeus is the one that created woman and Hesiod hates women so much, how is Zeus still his hero?
How is Zeus what?
How is Zeus still his hero in his mind?
Oh, that's another good question. Anybody have any ideas? Why would Zeus still, or why would Hesiod still consider Zeus his hero? I mean, that's a really good question. It's kind of, yeah.
I mean, it's not like Zeus created women, out of positivity. He did it to punish man, right? So.
And yeah, and we can certainly take that. We can take that view, especially from Hesiod's point of view. Yeah, go.
I feel like you might just be willing to overlook that.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're on the right track. He's willing to overlook that. Why would he? Or
Maybe he simply thought that he deserved the punishment, so he's like, okay, that's fair.
yeah, okay. I think that's good building off of each other. I think that you're on the right track. Yeah. The idea is that we kind of deserved it. Anybody else? Yeah.
It said too to balance out the good.
Ah.
To agree with balance out the good. I believe it. I can't remember where the argument said that, but it did say that. I'm pretty sure.
Balance out the good.
Yeah.
Yeah. One step forward, one step back. Does anybody have anything to add? I mean, these are all points, all built on each other. Yeah.
I mean, since he idolizes Zeus so that, because he takes out his anger on women anyways, he might as well just take out Zeus's curse on women to be like, to continue.
Yeah, exactly. So Zeus has to put a curse, so we might as well. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah.
Might as well put it on women. Yeah. Yeah.
Like, women are also just necessary for people to exist. So maybe because they currently existed, and Hesiod was kind of like, well, we're going to be here eventually. So.
Yeah. Women exist, so we might as well deal with it. Yeah. Yeah. And
They need women to populate, so.
yeah. Not only that. Yeah. Sorry.
Just accepted it as, we need it to populate, but it's still not a good thing, but we do what we do.
But we do what we do, exactly. It's accepting kind of the paradigm. Does Hesiod like the time he lives in? Did you guys talk about the different ages? The Golden Age, Silver Age, Bronze Age, Age of Heroes, and the Iron Age?
Not in those terms, but
None of those terms?
I think we discussed different eras. But.
It was like mentioned, but we didn't go into it.
It was mentioned? Oh, okay. No, I mean, if you read the Iron Age, the Iron Age section, it's probably in the book somewhere. I don't know where it would be. But he doesn't like his own age. And like you guys said, he kind of accepts the time that he's in. I think I agree with you. It's bad. He accepts it. He still depends on Zeus for a lot. Like, his works and days is addressed to his brother Perseus. He wants Zeus. He's trying to convince Perseus, listen, you do bad things, Zeus is going to get you. But he also has this pessimistic view of his world. Things aren't going well, and he sees them getting worse. Each age gets progressively worse, and people age more, and as many technological improvements that they get, things also get worse as they progress. That's the price of civilization, of increased culture, yeah.
I think it might also just kind of reflect the more broad cognitive dissonance of the time. I think somebody else mentioned over here about having female goddesses who are very powerful, yet also women being second-class citizens.
What do you mean by that? Could you elaborate on that a little?
Yeah, just that we're sort of trying to figure out why is it that Zeus is still as as homely, but at the same time Zeus made women. There just seems to be some cognitive dissonance around whether women should be heralded or not, because that they're goddesses and powerful, yet also women are treated quite poorly, and so maybe this is just another example of that, where in some cases women are okay, in some cases women aren't okay. So
Well, as goddesses, they certainly are. From Hesiod's point of view, they're perfect, right? And so there is dissonance. You and then, yeah.
Yeah, so probably he accepts the goddesses because they have powers and they can do things for them. They provide, beauty and everything else, but the average woman, she does nothing, right? She can't do anything for him except for clean the house and bear children.
Yeah, and why do we need to get married? You need to have children. Why do you need to have children?
To pass on your property.
Pass on your property. Yeah, you pass on your property, and one more thing. Yeah.
Take care of you when you're old.
Take care of you when you're old. Yeah. So these are the society. They do not have elderly or what do they call home care for elderly people at that time. Your parents take care of you. In many parts of Greece today, they have like houses full of different generations of people because you take care of people. You take care of your parents. Sorry, you have something.
I was just gonna say that maybe he wasn't mentally stable because he also claimed that the muses and he had a divine voice in his ear. So maybe he had some type of traumatic experience, maybe a bad upbringing with his mother or his sister or a woman who rejected him.
Yeah.
And just wasn't generally mentally stable and blamed it on women and just saw men as so much greater in that sense.
And that's being very fair. That's being very fair that, he probably did not have a great experience with women. I still would love to get his wife's point of view on that, what she thinks of him. But yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. I mean, he might have had a traumatic experience that told his life on people, life wasn't easy for him probably? I don't know. But yeah, you might be right on that. Yeah.
Could this be also because back in that time, gods did crazy things all the time, and people still respected them.
Yeah.
Even biblically, God was like, "Yeah, kill your son for me," and people were just like, "Yep, gonna do that." And so it could be something that's I didn't particularly like when he did this thing to us, but I still, it's like a fear and respect.
That's an excellent point. Hesiod accepts the gods, he accepts the harsh truth. The gods match the truth, the reality that he lives in, even though he still has respect. I'm just building on what you said. But the way Hesiod views gods, the way you haven't talked about Homer yet, but when you watch I've had a lot of students over the years comment that they can't believe that Homer depicts the gods as he does. They act like humans. And not great humans either. Petty ones. That's how gods were depicted, even though you worship them. It's not until later, even in the Old Testament, you get a god maybe that is not so recognizable to us. Once philosophers come into the mix, philosophy develops, and start talking about the gods, then you get a different picture of the gods and what's expected of the gods. And then people like Plato, I'm not sure if you ever heard of him, you've probably heard of him, but he's a philosopher of the late 5th into the 4th century. And he certainly did not like the stories of the gods that Hesiod told or Homer told, because the gods don't act like this. They don't do things for petty reasons. Zeus wouldn't take revenge. Zeus wouldn't even be tricked by Prometheus down. Hesiod tries to cover that one up by saying, oh, Zeus knew. He knew he was being tricked, but he picked it anyway, and he was going to punish them for it. No. Plato doesn't like that fiction, and he doesn't like the way the gods are depicted in Homer. You'll see that when you read them. In fact, in Homer, the gods line up. The ones that support the Trojans and the ones that support the other Greeks line up and they fight each other. Plato found that abhorrent. That's not the way gods are supposed to act. They're supposed to be perfect. Better than humans, right? And that's more of the way we view gods today. That's more recognizable. Not Hesiod, not Homer, but this is the reality of the times. This is the way you depict the gods. That's the way he thinks of the gods. And I guess that's as close as perfect. It's kind of a toxic relationship, really, between the gods and him. So does that add to your point, or?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else anybody wants to add, or any questions before? Yeah, we have a few minutes. Okay, so we have Semonides of Amorgos. And I put that up there, Semonides. I changed the PowerPoint just before class. I added a few things. I only put Semonides of Amorgos because there's another Semonides later. Not that this would ever come up, but just to clarify, there's two Semonides. And they think he lived in the 7th century, so the mid-7th century. So he's one of our earliest Greek poets, after Homer, after Hesiod, and now we have Semonides. And he wrote a very particular, I'll talk a little more about him. We don't know a lot about him. He was born on the island of Samos. When he was a young man, him and a bunch of other young men founded a colony on another island near Samos. That little island, Samos, is right here. And that little island, Amorgos, is right here. I don't think if you visited Greece, you would even visit that one. Probably find it more difficult to find a ferry to visit that one. But that's where he and other young men founded a colony. Now, he is known as a poet. He was an early iambigrapher, or a writer of iambic poetry. And all an iambos is a type of meter, a rhythm that you sing the poetry. And this was a type of poetry that they don't know how it developed. They don't necessarily know what it was originally used for, why it developed the way it did, but it became a type of poetry, a rhythm, that you would use to jest, to entertain, to insult, to embarrass other people. So it's kind of a toxic one. But this is actually this type of poetry, and the jesting, and the poking fun and stuff, and entertaining, telling fantastic tales, was actually used in religious contexts. We know that it was used in festivals through the meter. Women actually sang poems in jest, in iambic. We don't have so much evidence of that, unfortunately, but they did. And so we do not have a lot of this early poetry, and a lot of it, Semonides, the passage that we'll talk about, and if we don't talk about it now, we only have a few more minutes left. We'll talk about it next class. Is one of the only poems that survive. It's out of all the iambic poetry from this early time period, from the 7th century. It's one of the largest fragments to survive, certainly the largest fragment of Semonides to survive. But the reason why we're talking about that is because we're talking about misogyny. It complements Hesiod's piece quite well, or we can juxtapose them against each other. And what's interesting is, because it's a certain type of poetry, we can talk a little bit about the context of why it was said, and what the effect was supposed to be that happened. No, we won't be able to deal with that today. But think about this: when you read I think you've all read the poetry. Think about, read the slides a little bit. Think about what iambic poetry was used for, and why this would be recited, the effect it was supposed to have. What its point was, and what we can tell from the author about this. So, he writes on, I think most of you, this is the assigned reading for today. Are there assigned readings? Do you have readings for next class? You do? Pardon? Okay, so I think the main one is Aeschylus. We're going to be talking about Aeschylus next time, right? Is that, yeah? Okay, we're going to be talking about Aeschylus next time, and we're going to be finishing up. There's no point in starting Semonides now. Sean might be right on time when he does his lectures. Finish what he's supposed to. I never do, so we'll have to continue just to finish this next time. Any questions before you go, or anything that you want to add? Okay, we'll see you on Friday. Have a good day.